Hello, and welcome back to English 3020. This week we'll be heading to New York, not on the eve of the American Revolution, but in the early 1900s when the Harlem Renaissance was taking the New York neighborhood of Harlem by storm. So join me this week as we read the literature that was making history in New York City. Our authors for this week all belong to the literary movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, which began in 1917 and ended in 1935. And the word Renaissance, which will probably be familiar to you as it was part of the artistic movement that started in Italy and swept through Europe from 1300 to 1700, right after the medieval ages. The word itself means rebirth or reawakening. So again, this rebirth or this reawakening happened in Harlem, New York, and was kind of a revitalization of African American culture. And it's important to note that the Great Depression began in this period and ended 4 years after the period was over with the beginning of World War II. We do see some overlap with modernism in this period as they're kind of happening in similar times. And some of the Harlem Renaissance writers employ some of the same tactics as the modernists and would also be considered modernists in addition to being part of the Harlem Renaissance. But some, definitely don't meet the criteria or definition of modernism. And the Harlem Renaissance was really characterized by this outpouring of cultural, social, and artistic creation from African Americans which was focused in the Harlem neighborhood of New York. Black artists and scholars of all shapes and sizes, of all different interests and fields, flocked to the city, and many of them left the oppression and violence of the South in order to come north to kind of find a new way to express themselves, which would have been unavailable for them in their southern homes. And the Renaissance wasn't only occurring in New York, it was happening in other parts of the U.S. as well, but Harlem was really the epicenter of this activity. And this movement was characterized by racial pride. This partially came from the New Negro political movement, which demanded social and political equality for blacks, similar to the New Woman movement that demanded equality for women. So the artists and scholars during this time really sought to rework and rewrite the harmful stereotypes that whites had created for blacks. And in addition to that, to articulate and define an African American identity to sort of find their place in this country that both supposedly welcomed diversity and equality, but also relegated them to an inferior position. During this time, we also saw an interest in the art and culture of Africa as a source of both pride and artistic topics and structures, as well as a kind of a desire to reconnect with that lost African heritage. So that part of creating that American identity was calling back to a heritage that had, in many people's eyes, been stolen from them by slavery. Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Ellison, Countee Cullen, all authors we will read later in the semester, were a part of this movement, as are the three authors we're looking at this week. We saw a rise in journals that were specifically focused on publishing African American work in this time. The NAACP's magazine was called The Crisis. We also had publications like The Messenger, Opportunity, and Negro World that were all publishing these works by African American authors. Jazz and the blues, in terms of both music and in other art forms as well, were a major part of the Harlem Renaissance. This did lead to interaction between whites and blacks, especially in clubs and speakeasies. Unfortunately, though, this did not destroy the Jim Crow barriers that separated the races until the 1960s, and whose after effects we still feel and still linger on in our society today. So a lot of jazz and blues forms were being developed in both music, but also adapted to visual art and definitely written pieces like poetry and prose as well. And the Renaissance, though, it was important to note, was not a unified movement. So it was kind of this term that encompassed all these different authors and artists and scholars with all these different focuses, but it was characterized by a lot of debate and differing views of what art by African Americans should accomplish. How should it seek to portray the black experience? How should it seek to be different than other art forms that had come before? And pretty much every participant of the Harlem Renaissance had differing views on exactly what that art should look like. And then unfortunately, with the onset of the Great Depression, there was an increase in unemployment and crime in Harlem, and the Harlem Riot of 1935 effectively ended the movement. But again, that sort of outpouring of creativity from the black community really influenced later African American writers and still plays an influence in the writing of African Americans to this day. Our first author for this week is Claude McKay. He was born in 1889 and died in 1948. His full name is Festus Claudius McKay, and he was born in Jamaica and did not become a citizen until 8 years before his death. So he was a very influential writer in the American canon, but was not actually a citizen for much of his life and his writing career. His first book of poetry, Harlem Shadows, is really considered the kind of starting off point of the Harlem Renaissance, even though McKay ended up leaving Harlem at the very beginning of the movement. McKay's grandfather was forcibly brought to Jamaica from West Africa as a slave, and his grandfather had been a member of the Ashanti tribe back in Africa, and so McKay's father passed on some of this Ashanti culture and knowledge to his son, which influenced some of McKay's work and some of his poetry. And McKay had communist tendencies. He really viewed racism and capitalism as inextricably linked. So he ended up traveling to Europe and spent some time in Russia for part of his life, and the FBI actually prevented him from returning to the United States for several years because of those communist ties. McKay did eventually return to the U.S., but it was in the height of the Great Depression. He fell on hard times, but eventually kind of got back on his feet and began working for Friendship House. He ended up turning away from communism after the violence and horror of Stalin's purges in Russia, and became Catholic before he died. And McKay would go on to view Jamaica as a nostalgic place that he wished to return to, kind of seeing it as this golden land of his youth, a sort of kind of motherland. And much of McKay's poetry is in the sonnet form, which is a poem that consists of 14 lines. And there are two different types of sonnets, and McKay's sonnets that we're reading today at least match up more with the Shakespearean sonnets. So we're kind of seeing a similar form to what Shakespeare used in his poetry. And I'll talk a little bit more about sonnets later in the week. And also much of his poetry combined poetic techniques with political statements. So they were considered both beautiful works of art, but also beautiful works of art with a message. Zora Neale Hurston is our second author for this week. She was born in 1891 and died in 1960. She grew up in Eatonville, Florida, which at the time was an all-black town. She had a very close relationship with her mother, but after her mother died, even though Hurston had 7 siblings and a father, she had little support at home. And her upbringing in Eatonville did shield her from racism for a time, but this changed after her mother's death. So even though Hurston never finished grade school, she completed college at Howard University and went on to have higher education at other colleges in the United States. And after graduating college, she then decided to move to Harlem to become a writer. And Hurston was very well known for being very witty, charming, charismatic, and was always entertaining people with stories and tales of her Eatonville life and the people who lived there. In her later education at Barnard College, she studied anthropology and black folklore and traditions. Hurston was also known as a storyteller and kind of an impromptu performer, so it gave her both an academic and personal interest in oral narrative. And as a result, her work is kind of famous for capturing the voices of the people she writes about. So like how we saw Chopin use French phrases to show the speech patterns of the Creole society, Hurston takes that a step further in an attempt to really kind of reflect the actual speech in terms of sound and shape of the areas and locales she's writing about. We call this dialect, and Hurston and other black authors are very famous for using this to really kind of an attempt to portray on paper what that population of people or what that group of people would sound like in person. After graduating from Barnard College, Hurston studied the oral traditions of Eatonville on a scholarship that she won. When that funding ran out, though, she ended up getting an elderly woman, a white woman, Mrs. R. Osgood Mason, as her patron, which on the one hand was great, as it enabled her to continue her research, but it did have some drawbacks. Hurston, like other artists of the Harlem Renaissance, had to deal with the fact that white people were often the funders, publishers, and in most cases audiences of their work. In some ways, this could put constraints on what they were allowed to say or how free they could be in their expression of the black experience, because they had to keep in mind who was going to be approving and eventually who was also going to be reading their work. And Hurston got into some controversy with the other members of the Harlem Renaissance, going back to that point that there was a lot of disagreement on what black art should do. Hurston did not believe in portraying black people as only virtuous. She did not just want to present these over-idealized characters to her readers. She wanted to portray them as real people with both good and bad traits. And Hurston really kind of began publishing in earnest and kind of began writing more full-time during the Great Depression. But sadly, there was little interest in her work and African American writing in general because of the state of the economy. And in the last years of her life, Hurston ended up returning to Florida and earned money by occasionally working as a maid, which to me is just an awful tragedy as she is such a brilliant writer. Gene Toomer is our last author for this week. He was born in 1894 and died in 1967. And Gene Toomer's Cain, which we'll be reading part of for class this week, really received praise as soon as it was published in 1923. And the full work describes African American communities throughout the U.S. using a variety of different genres, including short stories, sketches, poems, and even a play. And this whole book was actually in some cases compiled from other published work that Toomer had created. And Gene Toomer is one of our Harlem Renaissance writers who's also a major part of the modernist movement. And Toomer was born in Washington, D.C. He never knew his father, but was raised by his mother and grandfather. And he bounced around from college to college, never earning a degree, but did hold a variety of jobs. He eventually became a superintendent of a small black school in Sparta, Georgia, for 4 months in 1921. And this kind of served as the inspiration and the foundation for Cain, his major published work. So the full text of Cain, again, which we're not reading this week, we're just reading some excerpts from it, is divided into 3 parts. The first part, which is where most of our excerpts are from, is set in rural Georgia and deals with the life of blacks in the South and the threat of violence they face at white hands. Part 2 then looks at black life in the urban settings of Chicago and Washington, D.C., and then part 3 is somewhat autobiographical, as it talks about an intellectual black man, similar to Toomer, who tries to teach in the South, even though he's not from the South originally. And Toomer, was kind of an eccentric character later in his life. He kind of spent the rest of his life after publishing Cain trying to find a spiritual community that suited his needs. He dabbled in Russian mysticism for a while, but eventually became a Quaker. And when he died, he left behind a lot of unpublished work that kind of showed the richness of his literary voice.